The dialogue surrounding the existence of evil and suffering in conjunction with a fully omnipotent, benevolent, and knowledgeable God is referred to as the problem of evil. The interpretation of these ideas varies and was brought to the forefront by Greek philosopher Epicurus, with philosopher David Hume further popularizing it. This issue holds significant importance in the realms of theology, ethics, and religious philosophy, with much discourse about it taking place in other intellectual territories, including secular and evolutionary ethics. Generally, this problem is approached through a theological perspective, and responses are typically categorized into three types: refutations, defenses, and theodicies. There are two main ways of formulating this problem: the logical problem of evil, which examines the theoretical impossibility of the coexistence of God and evil, and the evidential problem of evil, questioning the likelihood of an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God in an evil-filled world. This debate has also branched out to incorporate the suffering of non-human life through natural disasters and human cruelty. Defining evil broadly as all pain and suffering may complicate matters. Marcus Singer suggests that an effective definition of evil stipulates that if something is genuinely evil, it cannot be essential and vice versa. This concept is further dissected by John Kemp, who states that evil cannot be categorized along a simple hedonic of pleasure and pain. The National Institute of Medicine notes the survival necessity of pain, thus challenging the perception of pain as unquestionably evil. While much anti-omnigod arguments base their reasoning on a general definition of evil, contemporary philosophers are more concerned with evil in its narrower sense, a concept of evil that demands moral condemnation and is only applicable to free-willed moral agents. This viewpoint acknowledges the presence of pain and suffering without labeling them as evil. Christianity even suggests that suffering holds salvational value. Philosophers like Yves Girard argue that ordinary wrongdoing should not be associated with evil, citing a qualitative difference between evil acts and common wrongdoings. Evil is said to involve unprovoked attempts or desires to inflict notable harm. The concept of evil, viewed through diverse belief systems, avails varying interpretations. In secular contexts, it may be associated with societal vices, egoism, criminality, and sociopathy. According to John Keyes, an act is evil if it is harmful, targeted at innocent victims, deliberate, malevolently motivated, and morally unjustifiable. Philosophical problem of evil is complex issue, wrestles with reconciling the existence of evil in a world purportedly overseen by an omnipotent and perfect deity. The debate circles around God's omnibenevolence and whether or not, in situations where there are no ideal outcomes, He aims to enable the best possible situations given physical limitations. The philosophical response to this issue differ and are often grouped into defenses or theodicies, though there is no universal agreement on the definitions of these terms. Defenses generally seek to challenge the logical argument that the presence of evil precludes the existence of God. A defense doesn't need a comprehensive explanation of evil and may not even need to be probable or true as long as it's possible, effectively nullifying a logically impossible contradiction. Theodicies, in contrast, are devised to offer a morally or philosophically acceptable justification for the presence of evil, a counterpoint to the evidential argument that uses the presence of evil as proof against the likelihood of God's existence. Philosopher Forrest E. Baird proposes that the problem of evil is also secular, occurring whenever humans ponder why evil exists and its place within the world. Peter L. Berger suggests that humans need an explanation for evil, a buffer against chaos. The debate around the problem of evil largely hinges on assuming that a being like God shares human perspectives and would want to eradicate evil as we define it. It presumes that God is a personal being involved in worldly affairs, though not all agree with this. Moreover, it assumes that humans can both identify evil and agree on its nature. What comes through is that the problem of evil can be described theoretically or experientially. The experiential aspect focuses on how belief in a loving God is challenged by real-world evils such as war, disease, or natural disasters. From a theoretical viewpoint, religion scholars divide the problem of evil into two subsets: the logical and the evidential problem. In historical religious texts, the problem of evil is questioned. Early Buddhist writings suggest the Creator may be evil due to the suffering experienced by sentient beings. Greek philosopher Epicurus, through the summary of Hume's version of his thought, queries God's capability or willingness to prevent evil, therefore sparking debate on the question: if an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God exists, how does evil feature in our world? What are philosophical and theological implications of evil's existence in relation to the concept of an omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent God? It presents a conundrum known as the logical problem of evil, formulated through a series of propositions, suggesting that a divine being powerful enough to prevent evil, knowledgeable of all possible evils and their remedies, and inherently desiring to stop them, would invariably eliminate evil from existence. The crux of the discourse points to an apparent paradox. If such a divine being as proclaimed by theism does exist, then why does evil persist in the universe? Various responses to this paradox have been proposed, with renowned theists, including St. Augustine and Leibniz, arguing in defense of a God that allows evil for justifiable reasons. The discourse presents sub-theories that propose a solution to this logical issue of evil by questioning certain divine attributes traditionally associated with God: the concept of omniscience, omnipotence, or omnibenevolence. The likes of process theology and open theism propose restrictions on God's omniscience or omnipotence in light of free will. While these theories resolve the logical dilemma, an existential challenge, the evidential problem of evil still persists. This perspective argues how the prevalence of evil, though potentially consistent with God's existence, may still trivialize or invalidate theistic truth. Further, the agony of animal suffering fueled by natural disasters, predators, or innate cruelty extends the problem of evil beyond human scope, questioning the inherent defense mechanism offered by theism in the face of pain and suffering. The discourse thus becomes a battleground of paradoxes, where skepticism of a conventional theistic model of God is contrasted against varying theistic responses, thus underlining the profound, unchecked persistence of evil in the natural world. Addressing the problem of evil, scholars like John Hick have explored the issue from the perspective of innocent, defenseless, but sentient animals suffering. This stance, as per scholar Michael Almeida, is possibly the most challenging interpretation of evil. According to Almeida, if God is able to actualize a perfect evolutionary world, but does not, it contradicts the inherent supposed goodness of God, leading to the question of theodicy. While traditionally, the problem of evil is addressed from a religious view, Peter Kivy introduces the secular consideration. He discusses the human inflicted pain and suffering even in the absence of a deity. He argues that while humans have a duty to avoid knowingly causing harm to others, the malicious and often irrational harm we inflict upon each other leads to a secular problem of evil. Explaining evil actions, Kivy suggests two primary theories, neither being entirely satisfying. The first is psychological egoism, positing that every human action stems from self-interest. In response, Bishop Butler argues that humans can also be motivated by specifics, like objects or desires, which occasionally include benevolence. Even then, for egoism and pluralism, the irrationality of causing harm simply for the sake of it remains unexplained. Several secular responses to the problem of evil have been offered. For instance, Michel de Montaigne and Voltaire argue that though destructive human traits contribute to evil, they also serve a purpose in social processes. They propose the idea of relative evil based on human knowledge, not the world or God itself. They envisage an orderly world where each element has its place. According to Émilie Rorty, coherentism in the writings of Bernard de Mandeville and Sigmund Freud offers a secular response to the problem of evil, revealing regulated vices as catalysts for a progressive civilization. In the eyes of the philosopher Plato, as recounted by Paul Elmer Moore, evil is the consequence of human negligence in the pursuit of good. Plato emphasized the notion that evil arises from a deficit of good, a consequence of human laziness and ignorance. His entire philosophy of education was a battle against this inherent human idleness and the reluctance to search for ethical drivers, which he believed were the real power sources of human lives. This lack of effort to seek and do good is the root cause that initiates human's journey into falsehood, self-indulgence, and ultimately evil. Another critic of this philosophy, Joseph Kelly, noted that Clement of Alexandria, a figure from the 2nd century Neoplatonism, subscribed to Plato's interpretation of evil. The renowned 4th century theologian, Augustine of Hippo, echoed this notion of evil as the lack of good. Whereas Schopenhauer, as per Mascari Akbar and Akbari Mohsen's examination, had a pessimistic worldview by highlighting the prevalence of evil and its role in undermining good. According to Schopenhauer, the good represents a harmonious alignment between objects and the will's efforts, while evil typifies the absence of such alignment. The ancient Greek scholar Theophrastus contended that the nature of existence encompassed both sides of contrasts such as eternal and perishable, order and chaos, good and evil, thus presenting a merging union of virtue and vice, portraying a naturalistic social world, acknowledging evil as a quintessential component of the overall good universe. David Hume argued that humans, rather than being participants in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, are more likely to project their personal disapproval onto actions and events. A contemporary reflection of this view is observed in Christian Science, which affirms that evils like suffering and disease are just illusions. But it has been criticized for overlooking the reality of war, sickness, death, and suffering. The advocates argue that infinite spiritual power is misunderstood by mortals who instead focus on non-existent evils. This illusion theodicy, however, has been disputed on various levels considering the existence of crimes, wars, terror, and sickness. The argument further problematizes the role of God in creating these apparent illusions. A possible response to the issue of evil suggests that God is not exclusively benevolent. The experimental hypothesis of the evil God challenge speculates if the supposition of a malevolent God has parallel implications to a benevolent God, contemplating whether it is more probable that God is virtuous, wicked, or non-existing. Distheism indicates disbelief in a wholly virtuous God, while maltheism proposes belief in a wicked deity. As Peter Forrest suggests, one serious consideration of an anti-God is the notion of a spiteful, almighty, all-knowing entity, which finds pleasure in causing suffering to its creation. This idea could be juxtaposed with another anti-God notion, a malevolent entity that destroys valuable things out of hatred or jealousy. However, an all-knowing, all-powerful being would feel no envy, nor would destructive hatred spur creation. Hence, Forrest finds such a depiction relatively implausible but acknowledges both kinds of anti-God, the spiteful and destructive one. All these diverse anti-God perspectives raise questions about attributing certain characteristics to God, be they benign, indifferent, or malevolent. Why not hypothesize a whimsical God or a theatrically inclined God, or Haldane's beetle-loving God, or, on a more serious note, a God who revels in creation, regardless of the ensuing joy or suffering? In contrast, the Catholic Church holds that power and knowledge are essentially good, and it is only their misuse that yields evil. Hence, the Church asserts that God, who possesses omnipotence and omniscience, cannot be evil or turn evil, as these characteristics sprout from omnibenevolence. The Roman Catechism explains that acknowledging God as omnipotent inevitably implies his omniscience and supreme authority. Therefore, if we don't have any doubts about his omnipotence, we must be convinced about all other aspects of God, including those whose absence would render his omnipotence utterly incomprehensible. Furthermore, the faith is better strengthened and our hopes invigorated by a profound conviction of God's limitless possibilities. High saints and mystics have said that the more miraculous truths divine teachings reveal, the more faith finds acceptance in the mind. Even when seeking divine favors, the magnitude of the desired benefit does not discourage us, but the constant reminder of God's omnipotence uplifts and reinforces our spirits. One could argue that the concept of universal theodicy suggests every imaginable situation could be justified within the spectrum of God's existence, ultimately causing God's benevolence to lose its meaning. Bedinson even speaks of a strong presence of anti-theodicy in religious discussions. Many believers, as well as modern theologians, see no clear-cut theodicy that accommodates every question or circumstance. According to Felix Christen, a fellow at Goethe University in Frankfurt, humanity should stand in humility and admit their ignorance in response to life, shattering catastrophes and the accompanying questions about God's presence. Prominent philosophers like Alvin Plantinga have expressed doubt about the capacity of theodicy to vividly clarify the reasons behind the existence of evil. Plantinga maintains that this lack of definite resolution is why he refrains from suggesting a definitive theodicy, but rather defends the rationality of theistic belief. From an atheistic perspective, the problem of evil aligns with Occam's razor principle. The coexistence of evil and suffering is reconciled with the concept of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God by assuming that God doesn't exist. The philosopher David Hume challenged the principles of God's benevolence and mercy by pointing out the unhappiness that exists amongst humans and animals, and the apparent lack of aim for their happiness in nature's course. Monotheistic religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism find this issue particularly critical due to their belief in an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. But the age-old question of why does evil exist has also been analyzed in non-theistic or polytheistic religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. John Hick stated that the common responses to the problem within theism falls under three main categories: the free will theodicy, the soul-making theodicy, and the emergent process theology. The underlying notion here, supported by philosopher and Christian priest Marilyn McCord Adams, is that the life, death, and suffering of Jesus have fundamentally altered the nature of existence. A transformation, if you will, of the very essence of suffering. This is the concept of redemptive suffering, where personal suffering is not just beneficial to the individual, but becomes part and parcel of Christ's redemptive power and spiritual emancipation in the world. This new perspective on existence and suffering alters the mindset of believers. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who reflected on the pain and impotence experienced by Christ while awaiting execution in a Nazi prison, poignantly expressed this in the words, "Only the suffering God can help it." This theodicy, this justification of God's goodness despite the existence of evil, has a particular focus on the world's victims, underscoring the critical importance of aiding those who suffer injustices. It suggests that followers of Christ must serve as surrogates for God on earth by battling against evil and being prepared to endure suffering for the sake of those marginalized by society. In studying natural, evil, and animal suffering, Christopher Southgate, a senior lecturer of theology and religion at the University of Exeter, has developed a variant of theodicy he calls compound evolutionary theodicy. Using three methods to dissect the interplay between good and harm, he posits that these two facets are inextricable, each shaping the existence of the other. Robert John Russell encapsulates Southgate's argument, outlining Southgate's belief that the inherent goodness of creation and sentient beings had to come through Darwinian evolution. The complexity, beauty, and diversity of life, asserts Southgate, could only emerge through evolutionary processes. Likewise, renowned evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, though secular, offers perspective supportive of this Christian view. He emphasizes that the evolutionary process of natural selection is the only viable path to adaptive complexity. According to these perspectives, the existence of physical evil, which is inherent in the Darwinian process, had to be permitted by God, as it was his only recourse to evolve complex life forms, including mankind. The pain and suffering that accompanies this process, therefore, are seen as necessary elements in God's plan for creation. Cruciform creation is a term coined to represent the continuous progression of life through struggles towards a higher goal. The story communicates the idea that everything in life is energetically preserved, reborn, and reclaimed, irrespective of the hardships we encounter along our journey. The focus of the narrative is Bethany N. Solerator, a theologian specializing in evolution. Related theology, she argues that as life has grown progressively complex, capable, and interdependent, so too has its capacity for pain and suffering. The narrative then draws upon the teachings of Southgate, who refers to Romans 8:22 to metaphorically convey the collective struggling of all existence as being akin to the tribulations of childbirth. In his interpretation, God acknowledges and shares the suffering of every sentient creature. Southgate further challenges the moral justification of evolution at the expense of prior species' pain, asserting that unfulfilled potential must have another avenue for the realization. The story acknowledges skepticism towards Southgate's perspective by citing Wesley Wildman's critique, which fundamentally questions why a benevolent God would create a world subject to pain and suffering. Southgate responds by emphasizing that an evolutionary environment is the only birthplace for creaturely selves. He suggests that while heaven can eternally preserve these selves in peace, it could not foster their initial development. Importantly, Polkinghorne points out that while God doesn't orchestrate every aspect of existence, his intent is fundamental in shaping the universe, and the emergence of self-conscious beings is arguably part of that divine intent. The essence of this story is the exploration of the dichotomy of good and evil in creation and the role of free will, as viewed from religious, philosophical, and scientific perspectives. In a universe where beings are self-made rather than preformed, the dichotomy of good and evil exists. Evolution, although a manifestation of life's abundant creativity, inevitably gives rise to corners filled with waste and error. Genetic mutation, a key catalyst for the birth of new species, can unfortunately also birth diseases. This is epitomized by cancer, a distressing facet of creation, yet inherent to the very nature of biological creativity. The duality of good and evil, interwoven into the fabric of our existence, becomes even more evident as science unravels the mysteries of the world. Theologian David Bentley Hart broaches the concept of natural evil as a consequence of a human fall from grace, resulting in a world tainted by death. The idea of this fall is not framed within earthly history, but transcends it, accounting for the existence of death from the dawn of the universe. From another perspective, natural forces are neither intrinsically good or evil. They simply exist. Life depends on nature's processes, some of which sustain while some end life. Even phenomena like death and natural disasters are considered necessary for a universe in evolution. Moreover, the ordeal of confronting natural evils can be seen as a means to gain greater understanding of evil, thereby making our free choices more significant, hence amplifying the value of our free will. In terms of divine justice, some believe natural evils could be a form of penalty for human immorality. The problem of evil is often attributed to the existence of free will, the root of both benevolence and malevolence. Mankind's disposition to misuse free will is their own, not God's. In fact, advocating the free will defenses presupposes the greater intrinsic worth of a world with beings capable of making informed choices. The foundation of values such as trust, love, charity, and kindness necessitates this liberty to choose. Augustine's 4th-century theodicy of free will and contemporary philosopher Alvin Plantinga propound this perspective. In essence, the interplay of good and evil, the natural and the unnatural, all enveloped within the sphere of free will, lends profound depth and complexity to the saga of life and existence. Plantinga's exploration of the theodicy begins with Gottfried Leibniz's belief of infinite potential worlds available to God before creation. Leibniz, in his 1710 work, introduced the idea asserting that the world we live in is the best one that God could possibly create. Plantinga echoes this sentiment, asserting that while God had the capacity to actualize any potential world, including those with only moral good, factors inherent within these potential worlds might risk obstructing him from actualizing worlds devoid of moral evil. These hindrances primarily emerge from what Plantinga calls human essences and transworld depravity. Plantinga's theory proposes that scattered across the realm of possible worlds are myriad versions of potential human beings, each possessing their unique human essence. This essence is essentially what distinguishes an individual from others. Assumed variations in these versions might include instances where a person known as X unfailingly opts for the right choices in certain worlds. However, if in any world X veers away from this righteousness and opts for evil instead, the potential worlds consisting only of goodness become impossible to actualize while retaining X's perfect freedom. In these circumstances, where X always opts for evil at least once, the only worlds God could possibly materialize would consist of an X who commits a wrong at least once. Plantinga labels this phenomenon as transworld depravity. The implication is that God, if he desires freedom for X as an integral part of creation, must accept X's capacity to choose evil X's actions, hence define the kind of world that God can create, resulting in a world with moral evil brought out by the free will of creatures like. This principle of transworld depravity, Plantinga extrapolates, could practically apply to all humans, suggesting that the creation of a world composed of moral good, devoid of moral evil, and filled with genuinely free individuals might not be within God's capabilities. A world sans moral evil might only be achievable sans significantly free beings. Critiques against the free will defense argue that it does not adequately account for the magnitude of evil witnessed in our world. They contend that free will, while potentially justifying smaller evils, falls short when faced with hideous atrocities like rape and murder. Additionally, these critiques argue that evil acts often rob victims of their freedom, as in the instance of a child murder where the child's ability to express their free will is wholly extinguished. Critics advocating this position question why an omnipotent and benevolent deity would remain passive in such situations. Christopher Southgate, among others, opines that the free will defense falls short of comprehensively explaining instances where human free will is compromised. He proposes that it must be supplemented with a secondary theory. Critics further contend that the potential for evil could have been curtailed without curtailing free will. For instance, moral actions could have been made pleasurable or evil actions rendered impossible. However, free will proponents argue that this would compromise the essence of free will. In response, critics argue that this stance seemingly disapproves of attempts to alleviate evil and suffering, which appears irrational. A particular point of contention in the free will defense is the concept of natural evil, such as natural disasters or diseases that occur independent of human volition. Critics argue that a benevolent deity allowing free will should not necessarily permit natural disasters due to their seemingly unrelatedness to free will. Patricia A. Williams rejects this distinction between moral and natural evil, suggesting that since mankind and their decisions are a part of nature, all evil should be seen as natural. Alvin Plantinga, among other free will defenders, proposes explanations for natural evils, referencing Augustine of Hippo, who suggested the possible existence of supernatural beings such as Satan causing them. Plantinga emphasizes that this theory's validity is irrelevant. What matters is that it is not incompatible with free will defense. However, some argue that Plantinga's free will defense fails to address natural evil. Scholars like David Griffin suggest that free will or its superior outcomes do not apply to animals. Alternative defenses to free will are proposed by a minority of scholars who argue that animals, like humans, also benefit from their freedom despite the inherent dangers they face in their natural habitat. This free creatures defense has drawn criticism, citing the conditions of confined, domesticated, and farmed animals, whose lack of freedom and history of suffering seemingly contradict the claim. Process theodicy, dealing with the dilemma of evil, confronts the so-called problem of evil, recognizing that the concept of God proposed here does not hold absolute power, creativity, and self-determination. This interpretation asserts that God's influence and power are inherently circumscribed by the very existence of humans with autonomous wills. A central tenet of process theodicy. The narrative presented postulates that God had a plethora of possibilities prior to creating the existing universe, yet consciously opted to create free-willed beings. Fully aware of the constraints this creates, it suggests a non-interfering God who cannot impose outcomes without infringing upon free will. In this framework, God's will is merely a single factor in any given situation, with variable effectiveness, rendering God as a persuasive entity rather than coercive, striving to guide individuals towards positive directions, ensuring such opportunities are always available. Other distinctive aspects of process theology focused in this narrative are the real-time presence of God and God's empathy towards human suffering. The perception of God as a concerned companion and partner in suffering is posited to foster a relationship where tomorrow's reality is crafted together with the sufferer. Moreover, the narrative argues that God, as an embodiment of compassionate benevolence, resonates with human shards of agony and suffering. The responsibility amongst free-willed individuals for wielding this shared power and freedom is underscored as their involvement in mitigating suffering and compassionately intervening in challenging situations becomes essential. The narrative concludes with an open critique and examination of process theodicy's portrayal of God, its practicality and understanding of divine goodness, noting that certain enigmas regarding the problem of evil persist while new queries arise, especially on divine power and God's benevolence's interpretation. Lastly, it critiques the dichotomy of God's nature being coercive and persuasive, exploring potential areas of interplay between both aspects while challenging theological skepticism, stating that God's greater plan can fully justify evil acts. The doctrine of skeptical theism advocates certain inherent limitations in human understanding, particularly relating to matters of value and modality. This skepticism strives to undermine common arguments against God's existence derived from human experience. Consider William Rowe's proposition that there are cases of intense suffering that an all-knowing, omnipotent being could have prevented without sacrificing a greater good, or allowing an equally bad or worse evil to prevail. Skeptical theism questions how this can be definitively known. Similarly, it challenges John Schellenberg's theory on divine hiddenness, as well as the initial assumption of Paul Draper's hypothesis of indifference, which holds that gratuitous evil exists. Richard Swinburne criticizes skeptical theism, arguing that the mere appearance of inexplicable evils is sufficient ground to conclude that there can't be any rational explanation for them. Another critique points to the potential for skeptical theism to lead to uncertainty and skepticism about morality itself. Hidden Reason's defense, a theodicy argument, posits that the existence of evils may be justified by hidden or unknown reasons. Yet these hidden reasons, perceived as logically plausible, are also questioned. Critics argue that the assumption of hidden factors is not more credible than the belief that God doesn't exist or that God is not omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. The Hidden Reasons defense has a sub-variant known as the fog, profoundly hidden outweighing goods. Brian Francis argues that this approach fails to account for the coexistence of God and human suffering and neglects to explain why animals and other life forms suffer. The soul-making theodicy, credited to 2nd century Greek theologian Irenaeus, lays out a different perspective. Irenaeus proposes that humans were not created perfectly, but must actively strive to move towards perfection. This viewpoint starkly contrasts against Augustine's belief in human perfection at creation followed by a fall from grace. The keys to soul-making theodicy are its metaphysical basis. 1. That God's intention in creation was to facilitate soul-making for rational moral beings. 2. That humans exercise their free will in deciding their reactions to this soul-making process in order to develop moral character. And 3. That for free will to be maintained, God must remain hidden, a state achieved, in part, through the existence of evil in the world. In focusing primarily on C.S. Lewis's wider works, in conjunction with a minor focus on contemporary theological thinkers John Hick and Trent Dougherty, Weilenberg presents a comprehensive argument of the resilience and profound nature present in Lewis's soul. Making the Odyssey is called into question. However, as many see evils as detracting from spiritual growth rather than fostering it, Hick concurs with this worldview, acknowledging a disconnect with the real world where evils often result in the negative transformation of human spirit. Pain and suffering leading to undesirable qualities, such as anger, vindictiveness, and depression. Nevertheless, life tragedies often trigger transformative, positive change. Neurologists Brian Kolb and Bruce Wexler suggest this ability to change is linked to the brain's plasticity. Brain development process shapes its plasticity, highly adaptable in infancy but resistant to change in adulthood. Under the influence of potent stimuli such as bereavement and war trauma, the brain undergoes a tough internal struggle, resulting in self-concept reassessment and reality perception reshaping. Literature characterizes these experiences as life-changing events, often leading to personal transformation. The individuals ultimately emerge stronger and empowered, often diverting to paths they previously wouldn't have considered. Steve Gregg, while acknowledging that pain often brings no perceptible good, counters that such temporal sufferings can bring correction, purification, and noble qualities, aligning with biblical themes and offering partial alleviation of the unresolvable pain problem. A counter-argument suggests that if evil served the purpose of facilitating spiritual growth as claimed by proponents of this theodicy, logically those in poor spiritual health such as the decadent wealthy should suffer more yet. It is often observed that the pious are more familiar with world evils. This is illustrated through the example of Francis of Assisi. In terms of humanity's moral accomplishments, an individual's virtue is formed through mastering temptation, making consistent upright decisions, and through deliberate personal efforts that shape character. Yet, the value of such virtues, or the soul-making virtues, may only be apparent in a world where evil and suffering exist, where acts of self-sacrifice and charity stand out because they counteract persecution and starvation. Without such negative contexts, these actions may not be considered virtuous if soul-making virtues are only relevant in the presence of suffering. What would be lost if suffering ceases to exist is unclear. Animal suffering complicates matters, as there is no evidence suggesting that such suffering leads to soul-making or character improvement in animals. The concept of soul-making faces another challenge. The afterlife theodicy conceived by Thomas Aquinas to rationalize the existence of evil. Aquinas believes that the infinite nature of afterlife, in contrast to the brevity of human existence, justifies suffering in this life. In other words, the hardships of earthly life. Our hardships of earthly life are compensated by heaven's eternal happiness, implying a proportionate balance maintained by a just God. However, critics like Stephen Mason argue that this confuses justification and compensation. Mason names this the heaven swamps everything theodicy, suggesting that the traditional religious view biases towards coercion and fails to consider the suffering of innocent creatures who, according to religious teachings, don't have an afterlife. In the 2nd century, Christian thinkers endeavored to harmonize the existence of an omnipotent, all-knowing, benevolent God with the problem of evil, leading to the intriguing strategy of outright denial of evil's existence. Clement of Alexandria proposed several theodicies, including the privation theory of evil, reducing evil to a lack and subsequently disowning its existence. Modern groups such as Christian Science offer a more radical rendition of this refusal, suggesting that evil is ultimately an illusion. St. Augustine, a theologian from the 4th century, was an advocate of the privation theory wherein he stated evil is merely the absence of good. In his work, Enchiridion on Faith, Hope, and Love, he asserted that God as a spiritual and superior entity created the physical world out of nothing. Every creation of God is inherently good. However, there exists a hierarchy, with some creations better than others yet. These creations, given their origin from nothing, are prone to corruption and change. Human beings, who are susceptible to personal bias, often overlook how their lack of goodness can impact a collective good. In Augustine's philosophy, evil corresponds to the lack of good in God's creation. Evil is not a separate entity, but rather the willful rejection of God's generosity in favor of lesser rewards. This view has been upheld by philosophers like Otterberg, Anglin, Goetz, Davies, Lee, and Alexander. Critics, however, argue that this approach is linguistically manipulative and denies the reality of atrocities and human suffering. In the contemporary context, Christian Science provides a refreshed take on the privation theory, presenting evil, including pain and disease, as mere illusions. Christian Science theologians argue that human beings fail to recognize the infinite power of the Spirit, and therefore erroneously focus on the non-existent evil and suffering. However, this standpoint has been accused of disregarding the harsh reality of crimes and suffering. The concept of the illusion of suffering only prompts more questions, such as why would God create an illusion of pain and not put an end to it? Pantheism combines the principles of deism and pantheism, proposing that God, initially a separate entity, became the universe itself during its creation. Contrary to traditional religious beliefs, Pantheism contends that God is no longer a detached, all-powerful being capable of meddling in earthly matters, given his existence is no longer separate from the universe despite previously being omnipotent and omnibenevolent. God, as the universe, not possess these qualities. Philip Irving Mitchell, the director of the University Honors Program at Dallas Baptist University, suggests a number of considerations related to the universal problem of evil. Concerning the demonic and evil, Mitchell invites reflection on the correlation between evil and the belief in supernatural powers found in all three monotheistic religions. Under Politics of Theodicy, he explores whether explanations for evil and suffering serve to either justify oppressive actions of the powerful or liberate the oppressed. As for horrific evil, he urges contemplations on the justification, if any, for unspeakable atrocities like the Holocaust, extreme schizophrenia, mass genocide, and others. He additionally questions the possibilities of healing and restoration for the survivors. Through The Judgment of God, he encourages a debate on whether evil is the vindication of sin and whether universal experiences of evil can afford discussions on innocent suffering and profound atrocities. The Hiddenness of God delves into why God appears to be absent or indifferent towards both evil and good deeds. Metaphysical evil queries the nature and genesis of evil itself. Lastly, through The Existential Problem, he asks how human experiences of suffering impact discussions on evil at large and how these discussions can alleviate or aggravate the suffering experience. Mitchell emphasizes that literature provides both general perspectives and particular illustrations of these issues, using works like Dr. Faustus, Paradise Lost, Candide, The Plague, Night, The Brothers Karamazov, and more, as guidelines for understanding the issue of evil.